All right. Um, I don't, well, I guess I've got it. Sorry, Freedom Part 7, I guess, is where we are. Thank you so much. I know that many of you have come to me and you've said that this series is meaning a lot to you, that's really doing something in your spirit and in your life. We've got a long way to go in this. And I know it's easy in our culture and in our society, it's really easy to get bored with something. But I would encourage you just to open your heart and open your mind to this. God is really wanting to do some very specific things in all of our lives and bring us from a place of stuckness to a place of freedom. Amen? And so let's get into this today. John 8:32 is our text. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And then Galatians 5:1, where Paul says, for freedom, Christ has set us free. We've talked about freedom is not the absence of something, but it is the presence of someone, being Jesus Christ. We've talked about our identity. We've talked about taking our focus off of our problems. We've talked about recognizing the level of bondages, which is where we are now. Bondage is the opposite of freedom, and it manifests itself in two forms. One of them is a deep dissatisfaction that never seems to go away. The second manifestation, or another manifestation of bondage, is enslavement to destructive habits or other negative patterns of living that we can't seem to break free from. And we've talked about two levels already. We've talked about the level of bondage to bad definitions. In that teaching, I talked to you about the counterfeits, where we really looked at thinking that freedom was the absence of things, like absence of boundaries, if we got rid of this relationship, then we would be free, or something like that. But freedom, once again, is not the absence of something, it's the presence of someone. And it is the ability to act and react in life as the man or woman that we were created to be. Now, in a couple of weeks, we're going to go much deeper into that particular aspect of freedom. We've just kind of scratched the surface there. We'll go a little deeper into it later on. Last Sunday, I talked with you about how we can be in bondage to ourselves. And I asked you the question, how do you see yourself? And we gave you a few seconds to kind of think through that. And then I asked you this, what if you're not that? What if you're not that? And I left you last Sunday with that concept to be thinking about that throughout this week. Jesus said in Matthew 4:17, repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. Repent is not a turning away from something, but it actually means to think differently afterwards. And so thinking differently is the way in which we think. Think different refers to what we think. And we need to move away from thinking different and move toward thinking differently. How do we process information? And we need a whole new motherboard replacement in our life. And so we've looked at bad definitions. We've looked at the bondage to ourselves. And today, I want to talk to you about bondage to obstacles. Legitimate obstacles really do exist. Legitimate obstacles really do exist. It's this level of bondage that is most evident to us usually. Things that drinking, drugs, or some other addiction. But that could also be things like anger and rage, abuse, pain, unforgiveness, and the list goes on and on. And even, since we're in church today, even religion can be a form of bondage. And so we're going to unpack some of this stuff. But what about the things, the obstacles that are not as obvious? I mean, it's easy to see, okay, if we've got an issue with drugs or something like that, we can fairly easily see that. If we've got issues with rage or anger or unforgiveness, typically we can see that without a lot of difficulty if someone helps us kind of walk through that. But what about those things that are not so easily seen? What about those things that are not as obvious on the surface? What about things like expectations? Expectations. Ed Lewis came to me a while ago. Ed, I want you to come. And he shared with me something that God was laying on his heart, and I want him to kind of share that, and I'm going to use it as a springboard into this part of the teaching this morning. And it's about expectations, and I think it fits better here than it did a while ago. I hope it does anyway.
It was hard enough the first time sharing it with him. A lot of us grow up, we get to a point in our lives, they're right now for each of us, that we had hopes, dreams, expectations, aspirations, and it just hasn't worked out. We tried, failed, got up, tried again, failed, tried something else, failed. The things that we thought we would have by now because we're a certain age and we deserve this hadn't come about. And we find ourselves in a whole lot different place right now than where we thought we were a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago when we were younger. But I remembered it better a while ago. When we start realizing and come to the point in our lives that forget about our expectations. Yeah, they're going to remain with us, but we start pursuing God. And we don't run looking left, right, down, up, every which way. We just run after God. Looking for somebody in our life, something in our life, forget about it. Chase God. Go hard after Him. And when we do that, whatever's supposed to come into our life, if God wants us to have it, He will keep throwing it in front of you until we fall over it. But you chase after God, and it's when you do that, that is when that song that we sang ago, it is well. It is well with my soul. You will have peace in that deep, deep spot that only you and God knows about. That is where your peace is, and that's where your testimony will come from.
All right. It's a good word. So how do we find ourselves in bondage to expectations? It's easier than you think. It's much easier than you think. The definition of an expectation is that we have a preset mind. We have a preset mind. I expect this to happen this way. I expect you to say or do this. I expect you to act this way or not act this way. I expect this to happen to me. I expect God to answer my prayer this way. And any deviation that God does makes me mad because He didn't meet my expectations. It's like a contact lens that lays over our understanding. All the input into our life passes through our expectations. Our expectations are wrapped up in our perceptions of God, our perceptions of ourselves, our perceptions of the world in general, the people that we come in contact with. We all have a preset mind about things. These expectations serve as both lens and a filter. And we talked about the eye being the gate to the soul last week and the lamp of the body and all that kind of stuff. But we look through these lenses, we look through these expectations, but we rarely look at them. And there's a difference. It's like having, I see this a lot in marriage counseling and things like that, and I don't do that much anymore, but when I did a lot of marriage counseling and premarital counseling and stuff like that, I always see this, that as spouses, sometimes we get off track and we begin to talk at each other instead of to one another. And no one's listening. We're just doing a lot of talking, but nobody's doing any listening. This is kind of how expectations serve as both lens and filter. We look through them, but we rarely look at them. We rarely think through the things that we have. The things that do not fit our expectations are filtered out most of the time unconsciously. But our mind seeing what doesn't fit. By our mind seeing what doesn't fit, it's just something that happens subconsciously. We have a tendency, though, to filter out what does not correlate with our expectations and our perceptions. Here's an example from Scripture. We have, for 2,000 years, vilified the Pharisees around the birth of Jesus Christ and the religious people around the birth of Jesus Christ because we have said they were blind and they couldn't see what was really going on. But the thing about it is, it's not that they were blind. It was just that they had a certain set of expectations. They had a preset mind because 2,000 years ago, the religious leaders were expecting the Messiah to be born as a king. They'd heard it for years in all the prophets. He's going to be born as a king. Their expectations of a king was predisposed. It was already inborn in them. It was placed in them through culture and through history and all this. The expectations dictated that a king must be born in a palace and come from a known royal lineage. The announcement of the birth of a king would be clear and it would be obvious to everybody. Now, it's been a long time since I had kids at home, but I have 2 grandsons now. And every now and then I've got to watch a Disney flick. And a year or 2 ago, there was one about a frog, a prince that was a frog. I don't know the name of it. Don't crucify me for that. But when in that movie and also in the movie where the girl's like frozen, it's called Frozen, isn't it? Okay, there we go. I am purposely detached. I have a preset mind about that. If you love Disney World and Disney, that's great. You enjoy it to your heart's content. You enjoy it for me, and I will live vicariously through you. I have one more trip that I've got to make to Disney World when Connor turns 5, and he's just 2. So, but here's the deal. Even our Disney pictures, when a king is born, there is an announcement. The trumpets blast, and everybody's they know they're getting close to the birth of the next heir and all this kind of stuff. And so there is this expectation that people have. This is what was going on 2,000 years ago with the birth of Jesus. It wasn't that they were not looking for the Messiah. They were looking for the Messiah. The problem was they had a preset mind. They had certain expectations of how he was going to come into the world. No one would have called these expectations. It's just how things worked in that time. Now, this is why the whole baby in a manger, shepherds, teenage girl aspect of the story that 2,000 years ago, we find this so endearing today, but 2,000 years ago, it didn't fit the way it worked. It didn't fit. There was no announcement across the country. The announcement came in the form of angels talking to shepherds in a field in a place called Bethlehem, which is literally a speck. It's a dot. It was such a tiny, tiny place 2,000 years ago. It's not much bigger today. But I was sitting in the cave where tradition says that Jesus was probably born in this cave because it's one of the few caves around the area. And we're sitting in there, and Dr. Rutland makes this statement. He said, you have to go back 2,000 years in your mind's eye. And the thing about it is, a baby born in this town 2,000 years ago, everybody would have known it in town. Because you could have heard a baby crying all over the city. It's that small. It's that small. But no one expected the Messiah, who was slated to be the king, to come as a baby with no announcement to the entire nation, no pomp and circumstance. There was no royal lineage per se. None of those things. It's literally a story of shepherds and a teenage girl and a manger. It didn't fit what they thought was going to happen. And their expectations worked like a filter over the eyes of the religious community. They weren't trying to ignore the birth of the Messiah. They just couldn't see it because they were expecting it to happen a different way. So I think before you and I get really mad at them about that we need to think through our own expectations about things. This is a sidebar, and I just threw it in literally at the 11th hour when I was preparing this teaching for today. But it's the same way that we become offended in our life. We get offended because we have unmet expectations. When we expect someone to act or react in a certain way, and they don't do it, it offends us, and we get hurt. When I first came here to this church 30 plus years ago, I was the youth pastor. We had an associate pastor at the time. And there was just 3 of us, the senior pastor, George Skipper, Boyce Seeds, our associate pastor, and myself. That was the only staff that we had. And I remember one day, Brother Tees and I were working in the office, and he just said, we were talking about something. He said, Phil, if we could ever learn to remove our expectations of people, then we will live free of offense. And I thought, wow, what great truth is there, because that's it. You will not be offended if you don't expect someone to act in a certain way. But the reason we're hurt, the reason we go through offense, and the reason we deal with it, and it's impossible that we not go through it. It's going to happen to us. But you have to recognize it through the filters. It's about the expectations that we have built up toward other people and the way we expect them to act or react to us and toward us. That's kind of the deal. And we're offended when someone doesn't meet our expectations. Now, the next three of these obstacles flow from expectation. The next one is familiarity. I was in my devotions last week. I'm reading through the New Testament, and I was about halfway through Matthew, and I read the point there where Jesus went through the nation of Israel, healing the sick and doing all sorts of miracles and demonstrating the power of God all over Israel. But when he went to his hometown of Nazareth, he could only perform a few healings and no miracles. Now, I don't have time today to unpack what's the difference. But there's great detail given that there's a difference between a healing and a miracle. That might be something you want to unpack yourself over the next couple of weeks. Okay? But God himself was among them. He was walking and he was talking with them, but they missed it. Why? Well, it's easy. Think about it. Oh, yeah, well, Jesus? Well, yeah, that's Mary and Joseph's kid. Yeah, we saw him around the carpenter shop. He's been around this town for years. We watched him grow up. Their familiarity with Jesus robbed them of a demonstration of God's power among them. God was there, and they slept right through it. And as I was reading this passage, I began to think about it, and my grandparents, my mom's mom and dad, they lived in a little place north of Bay County called Bear Creek. And there was a railroad track that literally was about 50 yards from their front door. And every morning and every evening, the train went by. And I can remember as I got older, when I would spend the night with my grandparents, I remember the first time I ever spent the night with my grandparents, in the middle of the night, that train came by. And me and my cousins, we all slept in the living room on the floor. Well, it's kind of like, have you ever scared a cat and that cat just goes, ah, That's kind of the way I felt when that train came by that morning. It scared the daylights out of me. And we're screaming and hollering, and my grandfather comes out. He goes, "What are you boys up to? Y'all need to get to bed." And we go, "What was that?" He said, "That's just a train. Go back to bed." They'd been living by those train tracks so long, they slept right through the train. Why? Because it became familiar. It didn't bother them. But me, being at 8, 9, 10 years old, first time I'd ever heard a train come by in the middle of the night, I thought the house was coming apart. Because we didn't expect it. Kim and I went on a cruise a few years ago. Same kind of scenario, not with a train, but with a boat. And we went on a cruise, and we were staying up in the front end of the ship, and we went to bed. And sometime about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, they decided to weigh anchor. Yeah. What we didn't know was that we were 15 feet from the anchor port coming out of the side of the ship. And when they started pulling that anchor and that chain, clunk, 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 I stuck to the ceiling. You'd have thought I was Spider-Man. It just scared the daylights out of me. And I'm talking to he goes, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Well," and of course, 2 or 3 decks down, there's the crew and all this there. Yeah, but we don't even pay attention to that anymore. Why? Familiarity. The familiarity filter, we use it in a lot of different areas of our life. Remember when you first got your driver's license? You wanted to drive everywhere. As a matter of fact, you got your learner's permit. All you wanted was you drove your parents and your grandparents nuts because you wanted to drive everywhere. I can't wait till I turn 16 to get my driver's license. I'm going to just drive, and you want to drive, and you want to drive, and you want to drive, and you drive. And now, at this point in life, you don't want to go anywhere. Why? It's because it's become familiar. Well, we need to go buy groceries. You have to drive to do that? Let's just fast and pray tonight. It's just kind of like, oh, yeah, I got to drive across town. It's 2.5 miles. Because over time it becomes a chore and a drudgery. Guys, what about shaving? I remember watching my little boy watching my dad shave, and he had one of those razors, that the single blade deal, and you'd turn the little knob and take the blade out and replace it, and he would shave, and then he would take the blade, and he would hand it to me, and I would lather up, and I would shave. All I wanted to do, just as long as I get old enough to shave. By the time I was 13, I wish I'd never seen a razor. You know, and now that I'm 54, you know, I mean, it's just miserable. The things that we think are just wonderful and great and tremendous all of a sudden become such a drudgery to us. But what about church? What about church? Even though God has come to live in and among us, Emmanuel, God with us, we confine our contact with him to a certain day of the week and a certain time each week, kind of like a seasonal decoration of some sort. Why? Because it's familiar. And as we get a little bit older and our kids come along, we begin to find things that we can do on Sunday mornings to break up the monotony of Sunday mornings. And we call it family time, or we call it this, or we call it that. But the truth of the matter is that our church experience has become so familiar that it becomes drudgery. See how easily we find ourselves in these situations and in these traps. Familiarity blinds us. Familiarity with people, with routines, with relationships, religious systems can numb us to sleep. It happens in our marriages. You know, the first 2 or 3 years, you're living on love and everything's exciting and everything's new and experiences and all this, and then kids start coming along. And about year 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe even around year 10, all of a sudden, you're in this routine. And you might even start taking each other for granted at that point. Why would you do that? Well, you love that person with all your heart. Yes, I do. But you're familiar. You're familiar. And familiarity begins to blind us and numb us. And as a result, we find ourselves in bondage. The struggles in life that we face, in marriage, in our own individual lives, in church, in whatever scenario you may find yourself in, those situations, those circumstances, they are allowed into our life to stir us out of the familiar. I mean, if you never had a bad experience in your life, then how could you learn anything? You can't. If all you ever do is win, then you never learn how to be better. You never learn how to make the adjustments in your life so that you could deal with the negative when it comes. So not only do we have our expectations, but we have familiarity that actually flows out of expectations. But then there's the third level, the third area of bondage, and that's tradition. Traditions. Traditions are habits and routines that we develop as we respond repeatedly to what was once new. Something new happens, we begin to do that, and we do that over time, and over time it's no longer new, but we still do it. Why? Because it's a tradition. Well, I don't want to call it traditions, Pastor. I want to call it a habit. You call it whatever you want to call it. The result is the same. It used to be new. It's not anymore, but we keep doing it. I read a story about a mom and a daughter. They were in the kitchen. It's Christmas time. Mom took a ham out of the refrigerator. She took a pan out from underneath the cabinet, and she set the ham on the table, and she cut the end of the ham off and put it in the pan and put it in the oven and cooked the ham for Christmas. A few Christmases later, the mom said to her daughter, go in there and get the ham started for Christmas. We have Christmas ham every year, so go get the ham and get it started. And so the little girl went in. She took the ham out of the refrigerator. She took the pan out of the cupboard. She put the pan on the counter. She cut the end of the ham off, and she looked at her mom. She said, "Mom, why don't we cut the end of the ham off?" And her mother said, "Well, you know, sweetheart, I don't really know. I saw my mother do. That's how she taught me to cook ham." Well, later on that Christmas day, the grandmother was there. So the little girl sat at the table that afternoon after they're eating the Christmas ham, and she said, "Grandmother, why do we cut the end of the ham off before we cook it?" And the grandmother smiled and looked at her and said, "Well, I usually cut it off because the pan that I had was too small for a whole ham." Now, Think about it. Think about it. 3 generations. 3 generations are cutting the end of a ham off. When 2 generations earlier, because the mom had a different type of cookware and a different pan, that the whole ham would have fit, but because grandmother did it and mama did it, daughter was doing it. What once was new now became tradition. What about Sunday night church? Now, we don't do Sunday night church here. We used to for years and years and years and years. And growing up, I grew up in church. You went to church on Sunday morning. You went to church Sunday night. You went to church on Wednesday night. And if there happened to be a revival come through, you went every night of revival. Because if you didn't, God was going to strike you dead with a lightning bolt. And you were going to die because you didn't go to church. But no one ever asked the question, why did we have Sunday night church? Because everybody in America just did Sunday night church. And a lot of places still do. And I'm not, look, if you want to do Sunday night church, there's a few places around you can find that. But you need to ask yourself, why did Sunday night church come to fulfillment in America? Because it's not in the Bible. As a matter of fact, if you couldn't go anywhere, you could only travel a certain distance and you had to be home at a certain time and all this kind of stuff. So this didn't happen in the Bible. What is it that brought Sunday night church to America? There's 2 things. One of them is the circuit riders. The circuit riding preacher who was on his horse, he would drive from city to city and he would do services in city to city. And if you didn't get to your place before dark, you hung lanterns and you did a brush hour and that's what you did. But even in the early days of this, in the 20th century, in the early 1900s, you had a pastor, many times he would pastor churches in 3 or 4 towns, and he would have to make the rounds on Sunday to get there. And if you happened to be the last guy he was there, then it was a little dark. But you know what set Sunday night church in America to be a reality almost across the board? The electric light. When churches began to put electricity in their buildings, people would come from near and far just to see the lights burn. Because it was so different. All of a sudden you're seeing something, someone flips a switch or turns a knob on the side of the wall, and lights come on. And so they started having church on Sunday nights. It began just to watch the lights burn. But one generation after another, after another, after another, and now there are individuals that struggle spiritually if they don't go to church on Sunday night. When there's nothing in Scripture about it at all. As a matter of fact, if we really look at the reality of the Sabbath, by doing that on Sunday night, we violate the aspect of rest on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was set in place to nurture the 3 most important relationships of a person's life. Relationship with God, your spouse, and your children. You could only travel a certain distance, you had to be home at a certain time, and you had to spend that day nurturing those relationships and resting your physical body. But what have we done for years and years and years? You get here at the crack of dawn, stay till 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you run home, you come back, you do choir practice, or you do some kind of music rehearsal at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Church starts at 6. God forbid if it gets over before 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. And then everybody's got to go out to Pizza Hut or somewhere after it's over with. And so you go to work on Monday morning and you're wondering why you're not productive. You see, the church actually became its own worst enemy and became the enemy of the family in a lot of respects. Now, look, if you have convictions pertaining to the Sunday night church, go ahead. You have to live those out. But thank God this church doesn't have that bondage. Okay? And I hope that doesn't offend you. But you have to understand there are reasons why we do things that we do. And they're not all good reasons. They're not all good reasons. Which brings me to the 4th point. Expectation, familiarity, tradition, rigidity. Familiarity becomes tradition, and unbending tradition becomes rigidity. Rigidity always refers to a specific way of viewing reality. We've always done it this way, and change is evil. If my great-grandmother did it this way, and my grandmother did it this way, and my mama did it this way, if I deviate from that, then that change is evil because I'm violating their memory and the traditions they instilled in me. Why would you keep cutting the end of the ham off if you got a pan big enough for it to sit in? Think about it. Think about it. The reason for cutting the ham ended with new cookware, but a rigid mindset refused to stop cutting the end of it off, even though the reason for it no longer existed. It's important we get this, folks. You say, well, I don't know that I'm in bondage to this. Most of us are in some areas of our life. Most of us have unmet expectations that come from a preset mind. Most of us have familiarity issues. We have things that we're so familiar with that it's become mundane. We're locked into tradition. Do you know, even here at this church, that we have traditions that if we deviate a little bit on Sunday mornings, it messes with a lot of people sitting in this building. All we have to do is start with a slow song. And I mean, then this deer in the headlights look all over the sanctuary. Where are the drums? Where's the fast music? I'm asleep. I need to be awakened. I'm in a dream. You know, and we laugh about this stuff, and I'm using it, and I'm using the humor side of this to help you understand. There are things that we're in bondage to that we don't even realize we're in bondage to them. And we're so rigid in our mindset that if there's any level of change begins to come, and look, I'm telling you, we all struggle with it. We all struggle with it. Young people struggle with change for the sake of change. Well, somebody else is doing this, and we got to do it that way. Why? And they look at us older folks like, well, you guys are you're stuck in the mud and you're stuck in your own time. And look, here's the deal. We can all find ourselves stuck in chronocentrism, which means in our time. In our time. The time that I have, my music, my gender, my genre, the time span that I've lived, my lifetime, I'm stuck in the things that I like because they're things that I like. And if we change from that, we deviate or someone deviates, then we get all messed up. And the problem is not them, the problem's us. Because we're rigid. We're stuck in this thing. Well, I don't like it because of this, and I don't like it because of that. And what really we're saying is this: well, we've always done it this way, and change is evil. You see, rigidity is a way of thinking that limits our ability to flow in life and thus reduces the quality of life. Biblical example. New Testament, Gospels. Pharisees believed that a woman should remain a cripple because people were not supposed to work or heal on the Sabbath. So they believed that she should remain a cripple. Now here's the thing. Jesus comes on the scene. He has a better understanding of the purpose of the Sabbath and chooses to heal her. Now they killed him eventually because of stuff like that. But he came to show us a different way. He came to show us that not all change is evil, and we don't have to always do it a certain way. We get mixed up in our mind because we think rigidity and order are the same thing, and they are not. Rigidity and order are not the same thing, as a lot of people like to believe. Order is necessary. Order allows for change. Order allows for growth. It allows for context, for priority, or any of a multitude of factors that influence life. Rigidity does not. Well, bless God, it's been this way for 197 years, and so the next 197 years got to stay the same exact way. Then why are you driving a car instead of a Conestoga wagon to the grocery store? We think in terms that we've got the world in a nice, tidy little basket, and the truth of the matter is that we are stuck. And we wouldn't think anything. We would never consider going back to the days of the horse and buggy. I mean, we live in Florida, for goodness sakes. There's no air conditioning in that thing. I mean, it's hot. And I don't know if you've ever ridden in a buggy behind a horse. That's not a pleasant view. Not by any stretch of the imagination. And there are times when the odor is unbearable. You drive a car. Why? Because you adapted and you embraced change. In the building industry, they've discovered that in order to withstand the pressures of wind and earthquakes and all the things that go along with that, that a building must be built with the ability to flex. And that's a weird sensation. I was on the Eiffel Tower years ago up on the top of the thing. And I know I'm scared to death of heights, but when I go to a place where they got something like that, I want to see it. You know, and so I went to the top of that thing. But you're standing on the top of that thing and the wind's blowing and you go, and then your next step is, you're holding on to something because you feel that tower flex. Well, it does that to ensure that it doesn't collapse. If it is too rigid, it will collapse. And let me say this to everyone in this room here today. If you don't learn to bend, you will break. 100% of the time, if you don't learn to bend, you will break. If you don't learn to bend emotionally, if you don't learn to bend mentally, if you don't learn to bend physically, if you don't learn to bend in life with convictions, with desire, with all of this kind of stuff, I promise you, you will break. It may take a few years. There's going to be a point in time when your rigidity will cause you to collapse under the weight of it, because you're not built that way. You're not built that way. Rigidity will suck the life right out of you. Luke 4, one of the texts that we're using for this. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because He's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus came to set the captives free. But Satan has done all that he can possibly do to wage war against the message of freedom. The message and ministry of Jesus Christ is about freedom. It's about God coming. I have come that you may have life, and that more abundantly. I've come that you may have freedom. I'm going to set the captives free. That's why the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. But Satan is using this stuff to combat the message of freedom. He assaults the way we think of Jesus Christ. He attempts to confuse the followers of Jesus Christ, and he tries to distort the message of Jesus Christ. And he uses expectations and traditions and familiarity and rigidity. These serve as weapons in his arsenal against how we engage reality and how we digest and understand truth. For most of you in this room, you have no real bearing on what I'm about to say, but there are some of us in here, we understand years and years ago in church and religious circles where the women bore the brunt of the theology of the church. You couldn't cut your hair. You couldn't wear jewelry. You couldn't wear pants to church. God forbid, if you ever showed up in a pair of shorts somewhere, you were nailed to a cross somewhere with a scarlet letter. Guys, you had to cut your hair. You could wear a white shirt with black pants. And the shirt had to be long sleeve. You say, well, I don't have nothing to hang that on. Thank God you don't have anything to hang that on. You couldn't wear makeup, ladies. Ever. Ever. This is what religion did for centuries. And you may not have any way of hanging anything on this and understanding what I'm telling you today. But most of us have just changed that tradition for another one. And we want this one-size-fits-all thing for all Christians, that all Christians have to look this way and all Christians have to act this way. And look, there are certain things that the Bible has no voice on. And it's in those moments that you have to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Well, so-and-so is doing this, so it must be okay for me. No, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't matter what anybody else is doing. And this is the problem with most churches, that we get into this gossip stuff because we see what other people are doing, and we think that if they're doing it, it's okay for me. And we've never even asked God, Lord, would you like me to do this? Is this okay for me to do this? So-and-so is doing it. Why can't I do it? The disciples got into that same kind of argument. You know, remember getting close to the Jesus ascension and all this kind of stuff, and Jesus talked about all this kind of, and one of the guys says, well, what about him? He said, if I have him live until forever, it'll be okay. That's my business, not yours. Quit worrying about what other people are doing. Figure this stuff out. Are you in bondage to your expectations? Are you in bondage to familiarity? Are you in bondage to tradition? Are you in bondage to rigidity? When we have all of these things going on in our life, it distorts the reality and it distorts the truth of God in our life. But here's the real deal. Here's the real deal. It doesn't matter how much we are confused or distorted. The fact still remains that His truth still marches on. It's not up to Him to get in line with us. It's up to us to get in line with Him. Jesus said in the book of John, chapter 14, He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Oh, well, I don't believe Jesus is the only way to get to God. That doesn't change that reality one little bit. I think there's multiplicity ways to get to God. Think what you like. It doesn't change the fact that there's one way to God, and it's Jesus Christ. That Jesus Christ is truth. He is all truth. You can search for it in a multiplicity of ways, but the fact still remains that Jesus Christ is I am. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Just like bad definitions, if we identify the obstacles inaccurately, if we identify them inaccurately, we will stay stuck. And using the wrong tools to change them will add to our stuckness.